Welcome to part 2 of the Klamath Tribes Cultural Awareness Training. My name is Monica Yellow Owl, Behavioral Health Manager for the Youth and Family Guidance Center of Klamath Tribal Health and Family Services. Today what we're going to be going over is the resilience journey of the Klamath Tribes, and following restoration of the Klamath Tribes, what it was the healing plan, what is the healing plan, and how are we moving forward and transcending from historical trauma. I want to first start out by recapping a few things that we have learned in the last session. That is the tumultuous impacts of historical trauma at the soul level. I had mentioned at the end of that training that there are genetic impacts altering and changing our deepest fragments of ourselves and causing us to express ourselves in particular ways in present day. Also, I had mentioned in the last training that we are now treating the impacts and effects of colonialism, of historical trauma in present day. So we have a lot of work to do. I had been referencing approximately 160, 170 years of historical trauma. And in this session, I'll be talking about the impacts of that trauma and the resiliency journey to be coming up and out of the valley of that historical trauma. And that is what we will cover today. On the front lines of this work, not only are we reeling from historical trauma and its impacts, we are also collectively experiencing contemporary repercussions of that historical trauma. So we have this daily exposure to hardships that we as Klamath, Modoc, and Yahuskin people wake up to every day in the county in which we live. And so on the front lines of our behavioral health work, these are the things that we are coming across on a daily basis in our programming. First and foremost, high ACEs scores, those adverse child experience scores that you may have already been learning about in your nursing program. Some of the indicators that we're already seeing in our youth data is that in some of these ACE indicators that our rates are 2 to 2.5 times higher than the state average. So we know that 2 generations out of restoration, our youth are still continuing to see the impacts and effects of the historical trauma experienced. We have high trauma rates. We have a significant amount of work to do to keep our people out of the system, to help them understand and address their behavioral health issues. We have high rates of alcoholism and addiction and mental health disorders from both historical and contemporary trauma. There is self-medicating as a result of all of those things combined. We see unemployment. We see suicide ideation and completions. We have poor health outcomes in several areas and indicators. Early death is still among us. Family dysfunction is still prevalent. High exposure to risk factors is currently here, and domestic violence and definitely unresolved trauma. So these are the things that we are reeling with on a daily basis when in our behavioral health program we come to work and our focus is solely on the Klamath Tribes population or the tribal population living within Klamath County. So this is the work that we get to come and do every day on our jobs, is figure out how do we transcend, how do we treat and transcend the impacts and effects of historical trauma. I want to speak a little bit about cultural identity and the importance of cultural identity. Each person, whether Klamath, Modoc, or Yahuskin, or any other indigenous nation that's represented here in the United States of America, has experienced their cultural connection in a very unique way. We don't all collectively powwow. We don't all collectively hunt and fish. We all collectively don't climb into a sweat lodge and connect to our spiritual ways. This is very fluid and different even among tribal members. So it's really important to consider that up front when you're thinking about tribal people and how they identify, is that that this experience is very unique to each individual. Also, that there is a continuum of identity. It's not just a one-stop shop that you are a Klamath or you are a Modoc or you are Yahuskin. And so therefore you think, believe, act, and practice in these cultural ways, that there is this continuum of identity. And that ranges everything from living a very traditional lifestyle where you are harvesting and eating your own traditional foods. You are fluent in the language. You have knowledge of your land base. You are practicing ceremonies and customs and traditions, all the way to tribal members who may have little to very no connection whatsoever. So really this understanding that there's a continuum here of identity. Some of that is by design because of all of the historical impacts. Some of that is by choice, and some of that may be by Western influence. And so it's safe to say that there needs to be a desire to be connected, that we're not automatically born practicing our cultures and our traditions, that a desire to be connected needs to be present, and that desire to be connected varies among our tribal population. There are many American Indian and Alaska Native families that are multicultural, and we also see that within our tribe, that they adapt to the surrounding cultures. So we have folks who practice, organized religion. We have folks who are non-religious. We have folks who eat their traditional foods and folks who do not. So we are very multicultural in the world that we live in today. And we are incorporating, as we move in through our healing journey, incorporating and reviving and bringing back to life many of our cultural ways. So we'll be able to see our tribal members have more opportunity to learn about the people that they come from, learn about their cultures and traditions. I think it's very important to reference that historical trauma and grief events, those things that I shared in our first session together, that those things highly shape attitudes. They shape your sense of identity, and they definitely shape the level of trust that you have in yourself, but also that you have in the area in which you live. I touched very briefly in our first session together on the science of epigenetics and what is happening to your body physiologically when it experiences chronic and toxic stress over generations of time. So there are many studies out there that are present in this day and age that you can research by just Google searching epigenetics, or you can do a more informed research on maybe something like Emory University and the study they did with lab mice and exposure to chronic and toxic stress over time, and how the studies were able to show that generations forward, there was still impact to mice who didn't directly experience traumatic events. In the scientific world, it be considered some new research really taking off in the last 10 to 15 years, but it's taking a look at how your ancestors and their experience with chronic and toxic stress lives in the genetic code of future generations. So this science is really helpful in proving and making a case for what Indigenous people have been saying all along, is that we walk around in our communities feeling as though we've had an arm amputated, even though we haven't. And that's somewhat of what epigenetics research is proving, is that the things that we wake up and the things that we feel and we experience are not necessarily because of the physical environment that we live in, but some of those are codings of our DNA, and our genetic code has been fractured. So we are more susceptible to, and our genetic expression is negative in a lot of ways. So we are more susceptible to health disparities like diabetes, heart disease. We are more susceptible to mental health conditions like depression, severe depression. We are susceptible to addiction and alcoholism because we have only had contact with the Western world for a little over 500 years. So our bodies have not had thousands of years to acclimate to alcohol. So we are more susceptible to addiction and alcoholism. And the way that I can describe this is, as Indigenous people, we're literally born on the banks of a raging river. And that raging river contains all kinds of health disparities that we are coded for. we are susceptible to at higher rates than any other race in America. And so the business of epigenetics and the science of epigenetics proves that the experiences of our ancestors, the Indian wars that I talked about in our first session together, the genocidal tactics, the removal of land, the fracturing of very deep and intimate cultural ways, boarding school trauma, all of those things and those indicators of toxic stress live in our genetic code. And science is proving this. So we have a lot of work to do to understand how do we turn the science in our favor? How do we begin to mend our fractured genetic code? And we do that through protection factors, or what we also know as protective factors. And this is the reason why I personally come to work, my colleagues come to work, while nearly every tribal nation across the United States has robust behavioral health programs that are looking at the impacts and effects of historical trauma. What happened to our people? What were the soul wounds that we are looking to heal that are not only causing fractured genetic code of our youngest tribal members, but how our oldest tribal members may not even had the experience to be educated to understand how they in their lifetime were impacted, how their parents were impacted, their grandparents were impacted. So we're born with a backpack of historical trauma impacts and effects. And in our lifetime, it becomes our job to understand how we start unpacking that, how we start healing, how we start creating new ways of repairing code. They say that fractured genetic code can repair itself twice as fast than it's fractured. So we can do a lot of work in our lifetimes to create environments where healing can happen. So we come to work in the tribal behavioral health field specifically, this is always at the forefront of the work we do in our tribal behavioral health programs, and that is that we have a full understanding that we are aiding in the repair of 160 or more years of historical trauma. We're aiding in the repair of that. That is our duty as behavioral health workers, as behavioral health clinicians. Secondly, we are upholding the treaty rights and obligations that are listed in the 1864 treaty that I spoke about, and that we have rights that are due us. We have obligations to serve our people and provide healthcare services. And so upholding those treaty rights is paramount for the healing of our nations. Everything about treaty rights is connected to health funding, education funding, behavioral health funding, natural resources, all of those things to maintain and protect our tribal nation. Third, upholding traditional values. Really centering the work we do in our behavioral health program around traditional values, those values of helping one another, caring. In contemporary times, this might be called trauma-informed practice, but really we know this as loving one another, taking exceptional care of each other, and most importantly, looking out for each other. Our jobs are in behavioral health, our jobs are to stand on vantage points and look for not only the risk factors that continue to impact our community, but also the protective factors that are being built and reinforced daily by our individual tribal members who are stepping into healing. They are mending toxic cycles in their family systems, and they are really putting in the footwork to drive change across the tribe. So upholding those tribal values is extremely important to us, those traditional values that were so paramount in our living pre-contact. And I like to point out, this is a really important way of looking at the work we do, is it's spirit driven. I think it's safe to say that a lot of the work that we're doing as a tribe is spirit first and foremost. So we pay close attention to right time, right place, right people. And that really is driven by this ancestral belief that 7 generations ago, our ancestors were praying for future generations. They were praying about the future of themselves as their world began to rapidly change. Those prayers were continually being sent on behalf of the future, what is to come. It's so unknown. And so today in the field of behavioral health, what we look at as we get new funding or we get new opportunity or we see a period of growth and health in our community, we see that as the fruit of right people, right place, right time, that all of these things are coming to fruition when they should be coming to fruition. So it's a really beautiful way to look at the field of behavioral health from an Indigenous lens. Another thing that we are very fortunate to have in the state of Oregon, and this is work that is also taking off across the United States, but this is the ability to honor our tribal-based practices in the world of behavioral health. The state of Oregon has done a tremendous amount of work to honor the 9 tribes and their healing movements, to really understand that before contact, we had solid ways, solid practices to maintain the spiritual, emotional, mental, and physical health of our tribal members. And so tribal best practices is an approved method of treating our people in the state's eyes. So just like you might be learning about things like science-based practice, evidence-based practice, it's been driven into the research arena and studied heavily to prove its efficiency. Well, the state of Oregon recognizes tribal-based practice as equally viable to science research practice. So when we go in to write a prescription for our community on how to heal from elements of historical trauma, then we're allowed to use our cultural ways in order to do that. And that's what's known as tribal best practice. They're tried and true. And the basis of that is we've been here longer than 14,000 years. We have been connected and tied into this landscape for thousands and thousands of years, learning how to live with our world, within our world, really developing a deep understanding of our Creator and what our Creator's intentions was for us as men and as women. And that's really beautiful knowledge to be unearthing, to be tending, to be keeping alive. You know, our people were here to witness massive geographical changes in our landscape, like the blowing of Crater Lake. You know, in our traditional language, we call that giwas. You know, our people witnessed these cataclysmic events in history. You know, there would be death, there would be hardships, there would be famine, there would be drought, all of these things that happened in the natural world. You know, we would have made it through all of those periods of time, and there's no way we could have done that without this deep knowledge of who we are, how we are, guided in principle, guided by spiritual connection, living in deep harmony and in deep balance with the world around us. All of this backdrop by ancient mythological stories about who we are and why we are, an oral tradition to make sense of every cataclysmic event that we experience in our time. And so tribal best practices in the contemporary world, you know, we attach that to grant funding, we attach that to mental health implementation plans. We invest in our tribal-based practices first and foremost because these are the things that kept our people strong for thousands and thousands and thousands of years. Some examples of those would be child rearing practices, the way that a mother carries her child, the support that she gets from her community in caring for that child, the food that she ingests while she's pregnant with her child, the birthing process for that child, and the types and levels of support that she would receive from other women in her community. And as she's tending to her health, then her family members are going out and they're gathering and they're collecting plants to make the board in which the baby will rest. So this whole cycle of everybody having a place, everybody having a part. Cultures were very intentional for our populations because they all helped in the day-to-day life, the day-to-day activity. And so this is a really beautiful way to think about reviving a tribal nation, is using our best practices, using the things that have worked for us for hundreds of thousands of years. And I say hundreds of thousands of years is because we have ancient mythological stories that transcend beyond time as we know it. And those stories are still very much alive within our people. So even before Klamath, Modoc, and Yehuskin people became human form, we have stories that existed about the beings that once were here before we were created, and what their travelings were and what they were doing in the spiritual world, getting prepared to bring us to life. So tribal best practices in the behavioral health arena is a very big deal for tribes, not only here for the Klamath tribes, but tribes all across the state of Oregon and beyond. I want to focus a little bit on looking at tribal communities from a strength-based approach. I could present to you many, many, many data points that would show you that we are deficit-based. Our numbers are deficit-based. We have so much historical impact, literally at the genetic level, that there is a considerable amount of work that we have to continually be doing 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year to start turning the tide here, to start repairing fractured genetic codes. So 2.5 generations from now, they will not be born with the same predisposition to mental health disorders, to chronic health conditions, those things that we're seeing the impact of right now in this day and age. And so we look at our tribal communities through a strength-based lens, always looking for more of what is going right than what is going wrong. That's really key and really important because we have so much to change. We have so much trauma to transcend in our tribal communities. Number one, I want to point out the beautiful extended family and kinship ties that we have to one another. Our families are large, our families are beautiful, our families are connected, but we're all connected. That's one unique thing I think that maybe the larger community doesn't always consider, is just how sovereign we are and how nearly everybody knows everybody. And so when there is a loss that happens in our community, that's the vibrations of that loss go really far. And I love to see when our community rises to the occasion to support families that are going through that loss. It seems very ancient to me. A very high cultural value that we have is to take care of one another the best that we can, to be looking out for one another. And so that is one of the protective factors that we look to reinforce in our tribal community, is really look out for those in most need, provide and develop services to bring those people back into bring them back into the circle of the people so that they feel inclusive, they know that they're loved, they know that they're cared for. Another strength in our tribal community that we lean on and also look for is that long-term natural support systems. So what I mean by that is we have had this long-term natural support with our homeland. As any chance that a lot of us get, we're heading out. We're heading out into the woods, or we're going to the river, or where our whole family is loading up in the vehicle and we're going to a site that is we're traveling to sites that mean a lot to us, where we have a lot of family history. So those long-term natural support systems are significant, and they transcend beyond just the physical world. This relationship with our sky, with our star nations, with the water, natural and physical connections that we have. Those are our natural support systems. And so reconnecting to these places is extremely important for us. One example of this is in our behavioral health program. One of the strategies that we have for reconnecting our tribal members to their traditional homelands is called Muklukskemka. And in the Klamath Modoc language, that means the people are going. And then we choose a site every month, a different site. So we might go to Giwas, like Crater Lake. We might go to Tule Lake area. We might go to Clear Lake. We are going to choose sites that are highly revered by Klamath, Modoc, and Yahuskin people. And we are going to fill our vans up with tribal members who are looking to connect to those places or would have a benefit of learning about and connecting to those places. In our first session together, I talked about the loss of land. And I had posed the question in our first session together is, how do you even measure? What is the mathematical equation that somebody would use to even measure the impact that would have on Klamath, Modoc, or Yahuskin people? Losing your land base, losing your thousands and thousands and thousands of years old connection to these places. And every one of these places containing a story that's ancient, that tells about the significance of it, why we go there, what healing elements are at these sites and locations. That was a question that I posed in our first time, that was a question that I posed when we were together the first time around, learning about the tribe's history. And so what we do with Muklukskemka is we take folks out to these places where they maybe wouldn't normally have the resources to travel there, or maybe they weren't born with any type of cultural knowledge or opportunity to experience some of their land and some of these areas that are remote. And so we'll take them there, we'll give them the history of the location. We will share any ancient stories that we have about that site and the cultural significance of that site, and then we will work to create a relationship with it. Just like our ancestors did pre-contact and for thousands and thousands of years, is going back to the land is so incredibly healing for our people, because we are the land, we are of the land. Our genetic imprint is embedded here. And so these natural support systems are not just relationships with each other. It is also this very deep connection and relationship that we have with our land. And so that's one of the beautiful ways that we are looking through a behavioral health lens at transcending historical trauma, is land connection as an example. We also have tribal values, things that are inherently important to our people and have been inherently important and reinforced by ancient sacred narratives, that these are the values that we possess: generosity, kindness, looking out for one another, keeping culture and spirit alive, reciprocity, all of those things. These are very deep, very respectful tribal values. And so we share this sense of collective community responsibility, and through the treaty period, right? So when we were all dependent on each other, this is a way that I would like to describe this. If you remember in our first session together, I talked about The Klamath, Modoc, and Yehuskin people hold ancient narratives that tell us what our responsibilities are as Muckluks and Numu, as the people. And colonization has repeatedly fractured what our inherent role is to one another. And this started with the very first contact, the introduction of everything new, the enticement of trying new things that were outside of our culture. One of the most beautiful values possessed by the Modoc, Klamath, and Yehuskin peoples is the shared sense of collective community responsibility. Even prior to first contact, we lived in village systems where we looked out for one another. We didn't only make sure that our Earth Lodge had all of its provisions needed to make it through the winter, but that everybody had all of their provisions to make it through till the next season came along. And we were traveling together far distances to gather food, to gather all of our resources that were needed. So every day that we woke up, we lived in a system where you made sure you had what you needed. You made sure that each other had what they needed to live well. And it was deep-seated. This was a heavy cultural value, is this shared collective community responsibility. And when we came into a reservation system, that became fractured. You then depended on system for that kind of community responsibility. You stood in a line for food. You no longer went out and gathered food and made sure that your family and your loved ones and your kin and your relatives and friends had the provisions that they needed. You went and you stood in a line to get those provisions. And so this fracturing of collective community responsibility has been devastating because it has completely changed the landscape of relationship. And so we're looking to rebuild this sense of collective community responsibility, that first and foremost, we are all responsible for the growth and the healing and the movement of our tribal nation. We are all collectively trying to work together to move the ticker, to keep going, to make sure that we remain strong in order to face whatever may come next for our people. And so this is really being reinforced through our behavioral health program, our substance abuse program. These are the conversations we have continually about this collective community responsibility and creating opportunities for people to be inclusive of community responsibility, like hosting talking circles. Peer support is another traditional example of collective community responsibility, is being a helper, going out and helping people get on their feet and get back into the circle. And so shared sense of collective community responsibility is an absolute strength in the Klamath Tribes community. Next is our physical resources. We have many physical resources that are inherently important to us. One, for spiritual connection. Two, for food source. Physical resources such as our land base. At one time, we understood our world like the back of our hand. We lived within the boundaries that were created by Gumukamsh, the creator. We had a very defined view of how far our boundaries stretched, the medicines that were created for us, the sacred sites that were there for us to access to help treat ourselves for any ailment that we came across. So physical resources has always been incredibly important to the people because it's extremely difficult to separate land from indigenous people, because everything about us has everything to do about our physical resources. So in any way that we can connect to the land, and I use the example of Mukluk's Gemka, this is part of it too, is that we need to rebuild our connection to our physical resources. We need to learn about our sacred sites, go to them and access them and understand their purpose, because that purpose is still very much alive, no matter where that property is sitting or who is the owner of that property. The spirit and intent that our Creator had for us has always been the same. And so it's our job to find those places that are accessible or fight for the rights to access our sacred sites, because everything about our physical resources has everything to do with our healing movement as Klamath, Modoc, and Yehuskan people. Colonization and the movement and the stretch of colonization through Indian country continually proved that we were less than human, that we were to be conquered, with no regard to the absolutely astronomical knowledge that we possessed about our homelands, about life beyond our homelands in the spiritual world, our deep connection to the land that we lived on, knowledge of every plant, knowledge of every waterway, knowledge of every mountaintop. We were of the land. And this indigenous generational knowledge and wisdom now oftentimes sits on shelves in narrative, in ethnography, and in books. And so as we are seeking our healing, more and more of our people are taking those books off the shelf. They're cracking them open. They're ingesting all of that wisdom and that knowledge, and they begin to practice it. We are building our generational wisdom day by day. And these were things that the boarding school era attempted to take from Indigenous people, is they attempted to take every ounce of traditional wisdom and every ounce of traditional knowledge and replace it with Western education. So in my day and age and in my time, our job in behavioral health has to be connected to unearthing Indigenous generational knowledge and wisdom, but also going out to seek it ourselves. Those of us who are working in this field of behavioral health, and we are working on reigniting our cultural practices and our cultural ways, that work also includes that we are out in the corners and crevices of our homeland, that we are sitting in prayer, that we are asking our Creator for connection to repair and tie us back up into a tight relationship with our land base. So Indigenous generational knowledge and wisdom is key for the healing movement of the Klamath, Modoc, and Yehuskan people. I think that we are survivors, first and foremost. I am standing here today with you as a survivor of historical trauma. And my mother was a survivor, and my grandmother was a survivor, and her mother was a survivor. In the ancestral mathematics of it all, it would have taken thousands of direct lineage family members to have me standing here today. And through all of the colonization efforts, through Indian wars and genocide and smallpox epidemics, boarding school tactics, all of those things that aim to eradicate Indigenous people, to eradicate Indigenous knowledge, we had to maintain, we had to get up and keep going. And this thought is like, the way that I can describe it is like our ancestors continually woke up and said, okay, and then what? And then what do we do about it? And so in my lifetime, myself and my colleagues who are of this nation, represent this nation, then we too have to think about it from that vantage point. Okay, and then what do we do about it? What is it going to take? What is the equation of healing here for our people? And what do we factor in to all of that? And so this Indigenous generational knowledge and wisdom is key, to understanding where we went to pray, why we went to those sites, what particular animals represent, what is the values of our men and our women, what is our duty, our ancestral duty. This historical perspective and strong connection to the past is paramount. Because we have specific identity. And even though we are 3 tribes that through the treaty negotiations and colonization tactics, we got lumped into one tribe that's often referred to as the Klamath Tribes, there are 3 very distinct, very unique tribes living under the umbrella of the Klamath Tribes. The Klamath, who had multiple bands of Klamath Indians. The Modoc people, who had 2 very large bands represented. And the Northern Paiutes, whose territory stretches all the way up to the north and all the way to the south. And so, we have this perspective of this is what we are born to carry on. As Klamath, Modoc, or Yehuskin people, we are legacy carriers. And every day, we wake up, we get to choose how much of that legacy we are going to keep alive. How much of our ancestors' thought processes and patterns and ceremonies and ways of connecting, how much of that is valid in 2022? How much of that are we going to strive to keep alive? And then also live in this very modern world that we live in. There is a lot of work to do to repair tribal nations from the onslaught of historical trauma and now the contemporary impacts and effects of that historical trauma, while maintaining our indigenous perspective of who we are and why we are, while keeping this strong tether to the past, keeping that tether strong. Always in the forefront is, who do we come from? What was important to them? Right down to the language that they spoke and the songs that they sang. Everything had a purpose. So those of us in the helping and healing role in our communities, this is at the forefront of our thoughts often, is this strong connection to the past, strong connection to ancestors, leaning on them in times of hardship, calling on them for guidance and direction, unearthing vast amounts of historical knowledge and ethnography about what our ancestors sought to put down on paper and preserve for future generations who may want to pick this up and keep it going. So historical perspective of our land base, of the sacredness of various locations, all of those things are complex, they're depth, they're deep. And it's our job to keep that knowledge alive and to keep that perspective and strong connection to our ancestors burning bright every day. I want to talk a little bit about survival skills and resiliency in the face of multiple challenges. If you recall, in our first session together, I shared a story about Rosie. And Rosie was Kiantapusa's daughter, also known as Captain Jack. And she was a small child born into war, was in the Modoc War, and then would later be transferred by train to Oklahoma and exiled alongside of her parents, her mother. And, Rosie, I see her as like the light there, the small child that had this resiliency in the face of multiple challenges. And one of the indicators of that is when they brought her father, Captain Jack, into the stockade. And they allowed him to see his people for the first time in months. He'd been shackled in a jail cell at Fort Klamath awaiting his demise. And the main person to show absolute joy and excitement was his small daughter, Rosie. And the reporters write that she ran into her dad's arms and he embraced her lovingly, feeble and weak from war, and he rocked her in his lap the entire duration of the short amount of time given to him to see his family before he would be hung on the scaffolds. And so even Rosie shows us the depth of resiliency that our ancestors had in the most complex times that we can ever imagine. She showed resiliency as they all did. I mentioned how they were stone quiet in his presence. They were reverenced in his presence. And they saved their emotions until he left the stockade. You know, that amount of respect that they had for their leader. And so, you know, these survival skills are not only physical and technical skills for managing ourselves when we're out on our landscape, but emotional survival skills have been absolutely necessary in transitioning from our most cultural, natural way of living into this very contemporary modern world and trying to balance those two things daily. You know, so our task then becomes reigniting our cultural practices. You know, our songs, our dances, our knowledge of sacred sites, our traditional food sources, you know, that we, in a time when everything is moving really quickly into the future, before we know it, we'll see flying vehicles, you know, we'll see flying cars. You know, half of us is moving forward and half of us is moving backwards, maintaining that tether to all of those ancient teachings. And it's a really peculiar world to live in that takes a lot of time, and it takes a lot of foresight and insight to maintain those two roads that often feel like they're going in two different directions. So those survival skills are complex and they're interesting, but they are absolutely valid for living on as Klamath, Modoc, and Yuhuskin people. Cultural revival is at the forefront of much of what we do. It is one of the most enriching things to have any involvement in when it comes to the tribe, because we know that our cultural ways sustained us. We know that when we were climbing into earth lodges, when we were crawling into our spookless or sweat lodges, when we were seeking the face of the Creator from our highest mountaintops, you know, that we were at our best. You know, we were at our strongest mentally and physically and emotionally and spiritually. So when we can revive these practices, when we can build a relationship with a site that we haven't been to in 150 years, that is life-changing. That literally is shifting the trajectory of our people. And so that is really big in our behavioral health program, those kinds of ways to look at treatment plans for our people. Those treatment plans include things like attending ceremony, learning a prayer in your language, getting an Indian name for the first time, even if you're 40 years old. You know, just reconnecting, rekindling, and reviving our cultural practices and our cultural ways. As Indigenous people in 2022, we are continually building the ability to walk in two worlds. So I will go to my job and I will work hard and diligently through administrative processes and grant funding applications and policies and procedure manuals and all of these things that are they're required in a Western business model. And in that model, I'm also attempting to recreate opportunities for people to build their cultural values, to reconnect to their culture, to do all of these things. And so it's a very complex world to live in and try to do this work, and then also my own personal work, just using myself as an example. At 5 o'clock when I'm off of the job, then I can also focus more on my own personal connection, my own self-identity as a Modoc descendant and a member of the Pit River tribe. It's like, we're always continually trying to find time in our schedules where we can learn more about who we are. And I think one of the most beautiful things and a marker for healing is that I'm watching more and more and more and more of our tribal members doing this. They're balancing that walk in both of the worlds. They are spending their off hours time out on the land or on the mountaintops or sitting in ceremony or hunting and gathering their traditional foods. I see more and more of this. So that tells me that there's revival. That tells me that we are doing good work individually and collectively, and this will help in the trajectory of our people. It'll help us walk up and out of the valley of historical trauma that we learned about in our first time together. And then lastly, this community level pride, that we can take a look around, and even I'll use social media. Social media is so huge in this day and age, is that I can log into social media platforms and I won't get 30 seconds in without seeing a Klamath, Modoc, or Yehuskin person talking about cultural connection, speaking the language or singing a song or working on their regalia, or they're out on the landscape or they're hunting with their family. This is now becoming normalized. Our revived cultural practices are now becoming normalized, where, this was not the case 30 years ago. 30 years ago, we were reeling from the impacts and effects of termination. And so, the change and the growth of the tribe is deeply personal for each individual tribal member in varying degrees. This work in behavioral health is about getting kind of a level playing field across all of those degrees, that we're all going to push the ticker forward together. We're all going to climb up another mile up out of the valley of historical trauma impacts and effects. And that is the work that we as a tribe are doing today. We are in the business of transcending historical trauma. We're in the business of building solid cultural identity. And we are in the business of always, first and foremost, maintaining a love, connection, and reverence to our ancestral homeland. Nothing about that will ever change. And that's one of the beauties of being of and from this tribe, is that they are literal survivors. We are literal survivors, and we are destined and determined to transcend historical trauma. And so I want to thank you for the time that we spent together in this. And I encourage you to reach out to the tribes if you would like to learn more. I would encourage you to attend events that the tribes puts on. Do your research. That's the thing. It's one of the agendas that I had in this cultural awareness training, is this should be sparking your curiosity. You should leave here potentially with questions of, she said this, that was interesting. I would like to go learn more about that. I'm going to look into that. I'm going to look into the treaty. I'm going to look into, their connection to this land. I'm going to look into, traditional healing practices, transcending historical trauma. I'm going to look into the science of epigenetics and how epigenetics is proving that historical trauma fractures genetic code, and how even though we were not personally involved in Indian wars and in acts of genocide and the relocation to reservations, even though we were not there in the physical, how our genetic code is fractured because of that. And how it is never as simple as just get over it. This happened a really long time ago. I don't know why the tribal people continue to bring all of this stuff up, we're over that. Okay. And so if you take away anything from our time together, it is that historical trauma is embedded in genetic code. And our genetic code is expressing itself as being more susceptible to mental health conditions, to physical disorders. So keep that in mind. That is not a situation of just get over it. Okay. 2, that the Klamath Tribes is intentionally healing, intentionally focused on growth, and intentionally maintaining a deep and heavy connection to their land base. And with that, I just encourage you to go out and continually learn more about your Indigenous population living within Klamath County. You may go into careers in the health field and work for the Klamath Tribes. And you'll see this knowledge and this information come to full fruition if you do. And so I want you to consider yourself as a health ally. That you're leaving here and you can't really unknow what you've just learned. And so be wise with your education. Be wise with the knowledge that you've received today. And I encourage you to just go out and learn more.